This is the Bellevue Chapel Podcast from Edinburgh, Scotland. Welcome to part 2 of a discussion with Tim Haddow, David Knowles, and myself as we ponder the peculiarity and uniqueness of the Gospel of John. It's been suggested that John could be referred to as the Gospel for theologians. He has a different approach, and David, you mentioned that earlier. There's a Jewish tradition called Midrash, which I don't know, maybe not everybody's familiar with, but you fill in the edges of a story by reaching backward into spoken or written Torah. So you may decide that, a Christian who's doing Midrash might decide that the donkey Jesus is riding on was Balaam's donkey. That they reach back and bring things forward to fill in the story to make theological points. And because of that, sometimes John gets criticized because the facts don't always perfectly align with the facts in the other Gospels, which he'd seen and read, and is this correction or is this poetic license? What's your feel on that?
I think certainly if you're a skeptic and looking for ways to pull the story of Jesus in its entirety apart, then it's very easy to look at the Gospels and say, well, did Jesus clear the temple at the beginning, as John would say, or did he do it at the end as the synoptics did, or did he do it twice? I think the reality of life is if we three individuals witnessed something out in the street, we would all tell that story in a different way. A, because we would be standing in a different place looking at it from a different angle, and B, because we're different people with different perspectives, and C, because we may all have different levels of imagination, from Tim's cold advocate perspective to your perhaps more prosaic view of things, Tim, to my perhaps, I don't know, rather short-sighted view of life. So I think that's just the reality, and I think it adds to the riches of it. And actually, I think when you tease apart the number of times there are differences and the reasons for the differences, they are fairly few in number. But if you were looking for a reason to pull the thing apart, then you could do it if you really wanted to.
I think some of the answer comes back to those differences in structure to a certain extent and what John's trying to achieve. He has curated, I think, his stories, and that may be one of a possible explanation for some of the differences in perhaps sequencing of events, and the clearing of the temple is perhaps the obvious one. And I mean, I don't know whether it happened at the beginning or at the end or twice or whatever, but it's reasonably clear that it happened, and we have consistent testimony of that fact from the different Gospels. And I mean, David referred to my sort of normal occupation as a lawyer. If you see in court exactly the same story, then inevitably the submission that follows is that these witnesses have colluded with each other and made it up together, because exact consistency in eyewitness accounts is not actually what happens in real life. So we have to ask ourselves, I guess, what the significance is of the differences and why they might have occurred. And there's clearly parts of the gospel which John speaks of from his own perspective. So, the account of, rushing to the tomb after the resurrection, which depends which gospel you read, what order certain things happen, or who was first there, and so on. But, John is telling us about what he did, and he was there. It's his perspective on that story, and that comes through quite clearly in his description. But I think I agree with David, really, that the inconsistencies, if you look for them and try and pick them out, you can make a case about there being inconsistencies, but the significance of them, certainly in my view, is not something that undermines the truth of what John is telling us, and the significance that he attributes to these things.
I think the other thing worth remembering is, and John says it, even if you were to add up every bit of Jesus' life that the four Gospels managed to cram in, there's still a huge amount that hasn't been included in the story. And inevitably, when you're summarizing or arranging material or trying to group it in a way to get a central theme across, then you're going to change a linear time narrative quite dramatically. And I'm not sure that worries a Jewish mind as much as it might worry a logical Western story reader who likes things with a clear beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's not what we always get with Scripture.
I'm always touched by the idea. So John was, he and Peter and James, that's the inner circle, right? So those are the people who had the closest personal relationships with Christ. So you would expect them to have, so much more of a personal narrative. My best friend who got killed, who happened to be, and then to see it being less personal and individual, but rather cosmic and theological. It seems like the people closest to him saw him as a bigger deal than the people at a distance ever did. And I think that gives an interesting flavor to the book. Maybe that's just an observation, but if you would like to react to that, I welcome it.
Yes, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, there's evidence in all of the Gospels of what living in the moment felt like with Jesus. And, they are very honest about their own doubts and their own failure to recognize. They don't hide any of that, and neither does John. But I think when John sits himself down to record it all and to, I suppose, give us his summary of the life of Jesus, I think what you do get is a very deep appreciation of the one who loved him primarily, and he was able to respond in love for the master as well.
I don't think I've got anything that I can add to that.
Yeah, there's not much more we can put on that. Well, let's think about for our, I guess we call them parishioners here, our congregation, our members at Bellevue. What do you think that we could do to help encourage them more to dive into this fascinating and strange book?
So, I mean, I think as with any book in the Bible, it requires time. Okay, we said a year to get to know Jesus better. The reality is you spend every year doing that, and indeed, in a sense, we'll never come to a conclusion on that. But equally, I think often as Christians, we live in a busy world with a busy life, and we know we should read the Bible regularly. And many of us do that, and we kind of, and I've done it frequently myself, you skim read a passage quickly, you tick the box, you've had your reading for the day, but you can't actually remember what you read. Nothing really stuck. And I think if we're going to really develop our Christian life, Scripture has to stick. And I think the only way it can stick is to constantly keep returning to it. And I think I said when I spoke first on it, I'd read one commentator saying that when you study John, it's like entering a cathedral, and you need that quiet and that space and that sense of awe at the majesty of the word. And you need to spend time in it. Now, I think there's no substitute for doing that. And then getting, as you do that, a good commentary or a good study guide that perhaps lifts some of the mystery. And then, with God's Spirit and with prayer, trying to deepen your grasp of what God might be saying to you through it.
Yeah, it's one of these things I feel very ill qualified to advise people about, because I struggle with it so much in my own personal life, I think. I mean, I have to say, one of the things that I enjoy about being asked to give talks at church is because it really makes me sit down and study passages in a way that I struggle to do day to day. But I think, yes, just having a bit of space and time, understanding where the passage, certainly in a book like John, where the passage sort of fits in to what John is trying to achieve. So just having had that sense of, well, here's the part of the gospel where John is giving us 7 signs, and he's then interleaving those 7 signs with these I am sayings, or these bits of teaching of Jesus. And actually, there's links between these things. So sometimes when you read, a few words of Jesus out of the teaching, if you understand, well, what is it that's just happened, or it's just about to happen, that can help you bring out some of the significance of the words, because they just sort of drive home, the message. So when Jesus talks about being the light of the world, and then goes and heals a man born blind and brings light into his life, that sort of helps you understand the power, perhaps, and the message of some of the things that he's saying, in a way that if you just, as I say, just turn that passage and just read it, you maybe don't, or it's easy to pass by. So I think just sort of understanding where it fits in what John's trying to achieve can help us, I think.
I think the other thing is, and there's always a danger sometimes in preparing a passage to preach, in that it becomes all of a sudden an exercise in knowledge and education, both your own and the other folks you're going to share it with. And I think that's something I always battle with, because it's about trying to encourage a relationship. And I think the wonderful thing about John's gospel is, yes, it's rich in theology and it's complex, but it has so many parts where it just touches down to real life and scratches where we itch. If we're paying attention to it, clearly it does. There are lots of instances. We live in a very dark world that doesn't seem to have much idea of the direction it's going, and all of a sudden John introduces us to, as Tim says, the light of the world. We have a world that is bleak and full of despair and death, and we have someone who introduces themselves to us as the way, the truth, and the life. These things are easy to say, but they're incredibly relevant when we think about it.
We will conclude this series with the curiously unique inclusion of Lazarus, the great hinge of the gospel, and John's great focus on the events of Holy Week. This is the Bellevue Chapel Podcast from Edinburgh, Scotland.